There are mob bosses who ruled from the shadows, silent, discreet, careful never to attract too much attention. And then there was John Gotti. He was the man who turned crime into a kind of celebrity. While other dons hid from cameras, Gotti smiled for them. While other bosses wore muted suits, Gotti donned silk ties, custom-tailored outfits, and overcoats worth thousands. He didn't just command a crime family, he commanded the front page of newspapers, the flashbulbs of photographers, and the whispers of an entire nation. They called him the Dapper Don because of his elegance. They called him the Teflon Don because charges never seemed to stick. And for a time, he embodied a myth, the untouchable gangster who defied the FBI, mocked the government, and still walked free. But every myth carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. On the cold evening of December 16, 1985, New York City prepared for the holiday season. Shoppers hurried past the glowing windows of midtown stores, and businessmen crowded into steakhouses for expensive dinners. Among them was Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino crime family, arriving at Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. What Castellano didn't know was that across the street, hidden in the crowd, men loyal to John Gotti were waiting with guns. As Castellano stepped out of his car, gunfire erupted. The powerful mob boss collapsed in the snow. His life and reign ended in seconds. That night, the Gambino family, the most powerful mafia family in America, lost its leader. And John Gotti, the ambitious underboss with a taste for the spotlight, seized the crown. It was the kind of coup that changed the history of organized crime forever. In the days that followed, New Yorkers whispered in awe and fear. Who could be bold enough to kill Paul Castellano in broad daylight on a Manhattan street? Who dared defy the old rules of the Mafia, the rules of secrecy, of loyalty, of quiet power? The answer came quickly. John Gotti didn't hide. He didn't retreat into the shadows. Instead, he strolled into social clubs wearing designer suits, smiling for reporters, and acting as though he were invincible. And the media loved it. Newspapers splashed his photo across their covers. Television anchors spoke his name nightly. He became something the Mafia had never wanted, a gangster who was also a celebrity. For the working-class neighborhoods of Queens and Brooklyn, he was a Robin Hood figure, the local boy who had risen to unimaginable power. For law enforcement, he was a nightmare, the most visible mob boss in history, a man who seemed untouchable. In 1987, prosecutors brought Gotti to trial on federal racketeering charges. The evidence was damning. Witnesses were ready to testify. The government thought they had him. But when the verdict came, Gotti walked free, acquitted. It happened again and again. Time after time, indictments crumbled, witnesses recanted, juries refused to convict, and the press gave him a new name, the Teflon Don, because nothing stuck. Each acquittal only fed the myth. To his followers, Gotti wasn't just a boss, he was untouchable. To his enemies, he was infuriating. And to the FBI, he was public enemy number one. But what John Gotti never understood, or perhaps never cared to admit, was that fame in the Mafia world is a double-edged sword. The same headlines that made him a household name also painted a target on his back. The FBI doubled their efforts. Rivals within the Mafia grumbled that he brought too much heat. And in the end, the very thing that made Gotti a legend would also become his downfall. John Gotti's story is one of contrasts. A child of poverty who grew up in the Bronx, yet craved silk suits and Cadillac limousines. A gangster who lived by violence, yet adored by some as a neighborhood hero. A boss who ruled the Gambino family with iron authority, yet couldn't resist the cameras that would eventually help destroy him. From the back streets of New York to the marble halls of courtrooms, his life was a spectacle. But like every spectacle, it had an ending, and his ending would be as dramatic as his rise. This is not just the story of a mafia boss. It is the story of a man who challenged the rules of both the underworld and the government, who believed he could be larger than life itself. For a time, he succeeded. But in the shadows of power, betrayal always waits. And when it came for John Gotti, the cameras were still rolling. Before John Gotti became the man in the silk suits, he was simply John Joseph Gotti Jr., one of 13 children born into poverty in the Bronx. His father, John Joseph Gotti Sr., struggled to provide for the family, bouncing between jobs as a day laborer and never quite escaping the grip of financial hardship. The Gotti children grew up in cramped apartments where food was scarce, money was tighter, and survival was the daily lesson. The Bronx of the 1940s and 1950s was no easy place to grow up, especially for children of Italian immigrants. Streets were crowded with kids who fought for turf, respect, and scraps of opportunity. For young John, school felt like a prison of rules that didn't apply to his world. He wasn't interested in reading textbooks or following teachers' orders. He was interested in power, in respect, in carving out a place for himself. By the time he was 12 years old, Gotti was already running with neighborhood gangs. He found himself drawn to older boys who carried themselves with swagger, boys who always seemed to have cash in their pockets, and people who listened when they spoke. The streets became his classroom, and crime became his curriculum. Gotti wasn't just another kid trying to get by. He had an intensity that set him apart. He wanted to be feared and admired, and he wasn't afraid of confrontation. He was known for his fiery temper and willingness to fight, whether it was in the schoolyard or on the block. More often than not, he came out on top, his reputation growing even before he hit his teenage years. By age 14, John dropped out of school altogether. Education couldn't compete with the adrenaline and profit of the streets. Instead of sitting in class, he was hanging around pool halls, running errands for gangsters, and learning the art of hustling. He quickly earned a reputation as a street kid who was reliable, tough, and willing to take risks. One story from his teenage years became legend in the neighborhood. While trying to steal cement mixers from a construction site, Gotti miscalculated his move. The machine toppled, and in the chaos, his toes were crushed. The injury left him with a permanent limp, a reminder that even then, his ambition sometimes outpaced his luck. But instead of slowing him down, the limp only seemed to give him more character, another sign of toughness in a world that valued scars as proof of survival. It was during these years that Gotti came into contact with local wise guys soldiers and associates of the powerful Gambino family who controlled rackets across the boroughs. The Gambino men operated social clubs, bookmaking operations, and loan shark businesses that were woven into the very fabric of the community. To a boy like John, they seemed untouchable. They had money, cars, sharp clothes, and influence. When they walked into a barbershop or cafe, everyone stood a little straighter. Respect clung to them like cologne. Gotti wanted that. He wanted it desperately. So he began hanging around their orbit, running errands, watching, listening. He studied the way they spoke, the way they dressed, the way they carried themselves. Every gesture, every phrase, every rule of the street was a lesson. And slowly, he began to earn their trust. John wasn't the only Gotti boy drawn to the streets. His brothers Gene, Peter, Richard, and Vincent all gravitated toward crime as well. Together they formed a kind of family within the family, each one eventually working their way into the Gambino orbit. Poverty had driven them to seek out power, and the Mafia seemed like the most direct route. At home, their father scolded them, but couldn't stop them. Their mother, Philomena, tried to keep the family together, but the pull of the streets was stronger than any parental lecture. For John, the die was already cast. He wasn't going to be a laborer or a shop clerk. He was going to be a man of respect. What made Gotti different, even in those early years, was his natural leadership. Kids his age didn't just follow him because he was tough. They followed him because he had charisma. He knew how to inspire loyalty, how to make people feel like part of something bigger. He carried himself with the confidence of someone twice his age, and people noticed. That charisma would become his greatest weapon later in life. But in the Bronx of his youth, it meant that when John spoke, other kids listened. When John planned, others followed. He wasn't just a delinquent. He was already becoming a boss. Looking back, you can already see the roots of the man who would become the Dapper Don. The boy who hated poverty would later drape himself in the finest suits. The kid who limped after a botched theft would later walk proudly into courtrooms as if he owned them. The teenager who wanted respect would one day command the most powerful crime family in America. But at this stage, John Gotti was still just a street kid in the Bronx, hungry for more, restless, reckless, and determined to rise. He didn't yet know how high he would climb, or how far he would eventually fall. The Bronx didn't just shape John Gotti's childhood. It created the foundation for everything he would become. The poverty gave him hunger. The gangs gave him toughness. The Mafia gave him direction. By the time he left his teenage years behind, John Gotti wasn't just dreaming of power. He was already on the path to seizing it. And soon, that path would lead him straight into the heart of the Gambino family. By the time John Gotti reached his late teens, he was no longer just another Bronx street kid looking for trouble. He was building a reputation. Dropping out of school at 14 had sealed his fate. The straight world was closed to him, and the streets offered something the classroom never could: quick money, instant respect, and a sense of belonging. Gotti's first serious hustles revolved around truck hijackings, a favorite racket of New York gangs in the 1950s and 60s. Delivery trucks carrying everything from cigarettes to clothing would pass through the boroughs, and if the drivers weren't careful, those shipments would disappear. Gotti became known as a reliable hijacker, fast, fearless, and ruthless enough to get the job done. At first, it was petty theft, stealing goods from warehouses, lifting cargo from trucks parked overnight. But soon, he was organizing crews, planning jobs, and moving stolen goods through the black market. The money wasn't always huge, but it was steady. More importantly, it brought him into contact with the men who mattered, associates of the Gambino crime family. Gotti became a leader in the Fulton Rockaway Boys, a gang of young toughs who operated in Queens. They were small-time compared to the real Mafia, but they had ambition, and Gotti was their natural boss. The gang specialized in hijacking and armed robbery, and John quickly earned a reputation for both his daring and his temper. It was also during these years that Gotti developed a trademark habit. He demanded loyalty. Betray him, and you'd pay a steep price. Stay loyal, and he'd protect you fiercely. This code would follow him throughout his life, for better and for worse. Gotti's activities didn't go unnoticed. By his early 20s, he'd already been arrested multiple times: burglary, assault, car theft. The police saw him as just another street thug. But within the Gambino family, those arrests weren't necessarily a mark of shame. They showed he was willing to take risks, willing to do time if necessary. He wasn't a talker. He was solid. Still, his growing record worried him. He didn't want to be stuck as a petty thief. He wanted more. And more meant climbing the ladder of the Gambino family. In the 1960s, the Gambino family was at the height of its power. Led by Carlo Gambino, the family controlled vast operations in unions, construction, trucking, gambling, and loan sharking. Their influence stretched from Brooklyn to Las Vegas, and their soldiers commanded fear wherever they went. Gotti began to orbit men like Agnello Della Croce, underboss to Carlo Gambino, who ran the Manhattan faction from the Ravenite Social Club. Della Croce was respected, feared, and known for spotting talent. When Gotti came under his wing, it changed everything. Della Croce saw in Gotti a younger version of himself, tough, loyal, ambitious. He began to give Gotti opportunities that went beyond street-level crime. These weren't random jobs. They were tests of character, tests of loyalty. And John passed them all. By his late 20s, Gotti was running his own crew of hijackers, operating out of Queens. They targeted JFK airport shipments, seizing loads of merchandise before it ever reached the stores. Cigarettes, electronics, clothing, anything they could move, they took. The profits rolled in, and Gotti's name grew. But it wasn't just money. It was reputation. Within the Gambino family, everyone knew who John Gotti was. He was a man who could pull off daring heists, keep his crew in line, and deliver results. In 1966, Gotti's luck ran out. He was caught hijacking a truck near JFK and sentenced to 3 years in prison. For many men, this would have been a setback. For Gotti, it was almost a badge of honor. He kept his mouth shut, served his time, and came out with more respect than before. The Mafia valued silence omertà above all else. By refusing to cooperate with authorities, Gotti proved himself a true man of honor in their world. When he returned to the streets, his position was stronger than ever. Perhaps the most pivotal moment in his rise came in 1973, when Gotti was ordered to take part in the murder of James McBratney, a gangster who had kidnapped a Gambino associate. Gotti and 2 others lured McBratney into a Staten Island bar and gunned him down. The hit was messy, witnesses saw it, and Gotti was arrested. But once again, his loyalty saved him. He took a plea deal for manslaughter, served 4 years, and never implicated anyone else. Within the Gambino family, this sealed his reputation as a man who could be trusted with the dirtiest work. By the time he was released in the late 1970s, John Gotti was no longer a small-time hood. He was a made man, inducted into the Gambino family, and given his own crew to command. His headquarters became the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Queens, where he held court like a rising prince of the underworld. Locals respected him. His men feared him. And the Gambino bosses kept an eye on him, knowing this was someone destined for more. John Gotti's early years in crime were not glamorous, but they were the forge in which he was shaped. The Bronx gave him hunger, the gangs gave him toughness, and the Gambinos gave him legitimacy. Every hijacking, every arrest, every prison stint had built his resume. By the late 1970s, he was on a trajectory that would take him from neighborhood gangster to the most famous mob boss in America. But his ambition would not be satisfied with being just another captain in the Gambino family. He wanted the crown itself, and to take it, he would risk everything. By the early 1980s, John Gotti had risen to a position of power and respect within the Gambino crime family. He was a captain with his own crew, running rackets out of Queens and making money hand over fist through loan sharking, extortion, and gambling. But despite his success, he knew the real prize was still out of reach. The Gambino family, America's largest and most powerful mafia clan, was under the control of Paul Castellano, a boss very different from the men who came before him. Castellano was wealthy, refined, and business-minded. He saw himself less as a street gangster and more as a corporate executive of organized crime. He focused on white-collar rackets construction, unions, sophisticated frauds, while distancing himself from the traditional rackets of the streets. For ambitious men like Gotti, this was a problem. Castellano looked down on street-level crews, preferring money over muscle. He rarely interacted with the lower ranks, choosing to remain secluded in his Staten Island mansion. To many Gambino soldiers, he was out of touch with the realities of the street. To Gotti, he was vulnerable. Gotti's crew thrived on the very activities Castellano disdained: gambling parlors, hijackings, and heroin trafficking. Castellano had declared drug dealing off-limits, fearing it brought too much heat. But Gotti's crew was suspected of being heavily involved. Tensions grew as whispers spread that Castellano might move against him. Then, in 1985, Castellano made what many saw as a fatal mistake. He failed to attend the funeral of Agnello Della Croce, the underboss of the family and Gotti's mentor. Della Croce had been the bridge between Castellano and the street captains, a man respected by both sides. When he died, the family expected Castellano to show his face, to honor tradition. He didn't. For Gotti and others, it was the ultimate insult. Castellano's absence confirmed what they already felt. He had no respect for them, no respect for the code. The decision to move against Castellano was not made lightly. Killing a boss was almost unthinkable in Mafia tradition, a violation that could plunge the family into chaos. But Gotti was determined. He began to assemble loyal men, convincing them that Castellano's days were numbered. Key allies included Frank DeCicco and Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, men who shared Gotti's vision of returning the Gambino family to its roots of power, respect, and fear. Together, they plotted a daring move: eliminate Castellano and seize control of the family. The opportunity came on the evening of December 16, 1985. Castellano was scheduled to meet his new underboss, Thomas Bellotti, at Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. The plan was simple, but incredibly risky. As Castellano and Bellotti pulled up to the steakhouse, Gotti's shooters would be waiting. In the crowded streets of New York, in front of holiday shoppers and businessmen, they would carry out a mafia coup in broad daylight. That evening, Gotti and Gravano positioned themselves in a car nearby, watching the entrance. As Castellano's Lincoln Town car pulled up, the shooters moved in. Shots rang out, quick, sharp, unmistakable. Paul Castellano fell to the pavement, struck multiple times before he could even react. Bellotti was gunned down seconds later. In less than a minute, the head of the Gambino family lay dead in the snow outside Sparks Steakhouse. New York was stunned. The murder was front-page news. a mafia execution carried out with the boldness of a Hollywood movie. The rules had been broken, the old order shattered. Within days, everyone in the underworld knew who had orchestrated it. Gotti didn't hide. He didn't slink back into the shadows. Instead, he began to consolidate power, holding meetings, reassuring allies, and making clear that he was now the man in charge. Some feared retaliation from other mafia families, but Gotti had calculated carefully. Castellano had alienated many with his arrogance. Few were willing to avenge him. The other families watched, waited, and ultimately accepted Gotti as the new boss. With Castellano gone, John Gotti rose to the throne of the Gambino family. At just 45 years old, he was now the most powerful mafia boss in America. But unlike his predecessors, he had no interest in staying quiet or keeping a low profile. He reveled in the attention, wearing expensive suits, smiling for cameras, and making himself a public figure. The murder of Castellano had been not only a coup, but also a declaration. John Gotti would rule differently. He would rule loudly. The murder of Paul Castellano was one of the most daring hits in mafia history. It shattered traditions, upended the rules of the underworld, and announced the arrival of a new kind of Don, one who embraced fame as much as fear. For John Gotti, it was the ultimate triumph. He had gambled everything on one audacious move, and he had won. But as history would soon show, the very boldness that carried him to power would one day lead to his downfall. When John Gotti seized power after the assassination of Paul Castellano, he inherited not just the throne of the Gambino family, but also the weight of being the most visible mafia boss in America. Where others had chosen secrecy, Gotti chose spectacle. Where tradition dictated shadows, he stepped boldly into the spotlight. The newspapers noticed immediately. The man who had dared to kill a mafia boss in Midtown Manhattan was suddenly appearing in photographs, striding through New York streets with the confidence of a movie star. He wore $1,000 suits, silk ties, and camel hair overcoats. His hair was immaculately styled, his shoes polished to perfection. The press couldn't resist. They called him the Dapper Don. Gotti understood image in a way few mobsters ever had. He knew the value of presentation, not just within the mafia, where appearance signaled respect, but also in the court of public opinion. He dressed like royalty because he wanted to be seen as royalty. Every time he stepped out of his Ravenite social club in Little Italy, the cameras were waiting, and he gave them a show. His look became iconic: tailored Brioni suits, hand-painted silk ties, pinky rings flashing in the sunlight. He carried himself with a swagger that said he owned the block. To onlookers, he seemed untouchable, the king of Mulberry Street. Soon Gotti wasn't just a mob boss, he was a celebrity. The New York tabloids devoured him, splashing his face across front pages. Headlines like "The Dapper Don Strikes Again" or "John Gotti Beats the Rap" sold papers by the thousands. In neighborhoods like Queens and Brooklyn, people lined the sidewalks when Gotti appeared, cheering him like a folk hero. He shook hands, smiled, and sometimes even gave money to locals. To many working-class Italians, he was a modern Robin Hood, defying the government they distrusted and living a life they could only dream of. The more the FBI tried to paint him as a ruthless criminal, the more ordinary New Yorkers seemed to admire him. Gotti was rewriting the rules of mafia publicity. The press gave him another nickname: the Teflon Don. No matter how many times prosecutors tried to convict him, the charges wouldn't stick. In 1987, Gotti faced a major racketeering trial. The evidence included wiretaps and witness testimony that should have sealed his fate. Yet, in a stunning outcome, he was acquitted on all counts. Rumors swirled that jurors had been bribed or intimidated, but the headlines told a different story. John Gotti had beaten the government. Again, each acquittal fed the legend. The public saw him as a man who couldn't be touched, a gangster who walked free while others fell. Crowds outside the courthouse cheered when he emerged, smiling and waving like a politician. For the FBI and federal prosecutors, it was infuriating. They saw a dangerous criminal thumbing his nose at justice, mocking the system. For Gotti, it was victory and more fame. At the center of his celebrity was the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street. This was Gotti's headquarters, his throne room in the heart of Little Italy. From here, he held meetings, made decisions, and entertained both allies and admirers. Outside, the sidewalks were packed with reporters, tourists, and locals hoping to catch a glimpse. Every time Gotti walked in or out, it was a performance. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded toward him, and he often offered witty remarks or dismissive quips. Most mafia bosses would have considered this madness drawing attention invited danger. But Gotti thrived on it. He saw it as a display of dominance, proof that he was untouchable. Inside the underworld, reactions were mixed. Many Gambino soldiers adored Gotti's charisma, seeing him as a boss who commanded respect through presence alone. Others whispered that he was reckless, that his hunger for attention put them all at risk. The Mafia's golden rule had always been silence omerta, and Gotti was breaking it every day in front of TV cameras. Yet no one dared challenge him. He had proven his ruthlessness with Castellano's murder. Those who crossed him risked ending up the same way. So the Gambino family adjusted to the new era, one of cameras, headlines, and constant attention. For the FBI, John Gotti became the ultimate prize. Agents monitored him around the clock. They bugged his social clubs, trailed his cars, and built massive files on his activities. But each time they brought a case to trial, he walked free. Jurors were bribed, intimidated, or simply charmed by Gotti's defense. He seemed to bask in their frustration, flashing smiles at photographers after each victory. It was a game, and Gotti was winning. By the late 1980s, John Gotti was more than a mafia boss. He was a pop culture icon. His face was on magazine covers, his trials were televised like sporting events, and his name was known far beyond New York. But beneath the glamour, cracks were forming. His visibility made him vulnerable. The FBI wasn't going to give up. Rivals within the Mafia were uneasy, and inside his own inner circle, betrayal was brewing. For now, though, Gotti was on top of the world. The Dapper Don, the Teflon Don, the most famous mobster in America. But fame is a dangerous crown, and for John Gotti, it was only a matter of time before it turned against him. By the late 1980s, John Gotti wasn't just the boss of the Gambino family, he was the face of the American Mafia. The tabloids adored him, neighborhoods idolized him, and every courtroom acquittal added fuel to his legend. But while the public saw an untouchable Don in $1,000 suits, the FBI saw something else, their most embarrassing failure. They had spent years trying to bring down mafia bosses, and for most, secrecy had been their shield. With Gotti, it was the opposite. He flaunted his power. He mocked the government. He smiled for the cameras after each courtroom victory. And in doing so, he challenged the FBI, in the most public way possible. The war was on, and neither side was going to back down. Gotti's first major trial as boss came in 1987, when he faced federal racketeering charges. The government's case was strong wiretaps, surveillance, testimony from insiders. Prosecutors believed this was the moment they would finally put him away. But the trial unraveled. Witnesses recanted or refused to testify. Rumors swirled of jury tampering. Later investigations suggested at least one juror had been bribed. When the verdict was read, John Gotti walked free. The newspapers exploded with headlines, "The Teflon Don beats the rap." It was a humiliation for the government, and for Gotti, it was pure theater. He emerged from the courthouse smiling, waving to crowds as though he were a politician celebrating re-election. The people cheered. To them, Gotti wasn't just a gangster. He was a folk hero sticking it to the system. The FBI refused to accept defeat. They doubled their efforts, pouring resources into constant surveillance. They bugged phones, tapped cars, and most importantly, planted listening devices in the Ravenite Social Club, Gotti's headquarters in Little Italy. At first, it seemed impossible. The Ravenite was sacred territory, filled with Gambino loyalists who watched every stranger. But through careful planning, agents managed to slip bugs into the ceiling and furniture. What they recorded over the following months would become the backbone of their ultimate case. On the tapes, Gotti could be heard discussing business, handing out orders, even criticizing his underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano. For years, prosecutors had failed to tie him directly to crimes. Now they had his own voice doing the work for them. Even with the tapes, convicting Gotti was no easy feat. In 1989, he faced another trial, this time for assaulting a union official. Once again, the jury found him not guilty. Once again, the headlines screamed about the Teflon Don. Each acquittal only deepened the FBI's obsession. They couldn't allow Gotti to keep humiliating them in public. The Bureau formed a dedicated task force to bring him down, working closely with federal prosecutors to ensure that the next case would be airtight. By 1990, they were ready. A sweeping indictment charged Gotti with racketeering, murder, conspiracy, and other crimes. The centerpiece, the recordings from the Ravenite. For the first time, the government had Gotti's own words tying him to hits and to the inner workings of the Gambino family. But what truly doomed Gotti wasn't the FBI. It was betrayal from within. His underboss, Sammy Gravano, had been his loyal lieutenant for years. Together, they had overseen hits, controlled rackets, and kept the family strong. But when Gravano heard the Ravenite tapes, his world shifted. On the recordings, Gotti blamed Gravano for certain murders, painting him as reckless. To Gravano, it felt like betrayal. Facing life in prison, he made a decision that shocked the underworld. He flipped. Sammy the Bull agreed to testify for the government, providing detailed insider knowledge of Gambino operations. With his testimony combined with the tapes, the case against Gotti became overwhelming. In 1992, John Gotti stood trial in federal court for the crimes that had defined his reign: murders, racketeering, loan sharking, obstruction of justice. This time, there would be no miracle acquittal. Jurors listened as prosecutors played tape after tape, Gotti's voice filling the courtroom. They watched as Sammy Gravano, once his most trusted ally, pointed across the room and named his former boss as the man who had ordered hits and run the family. For the first time, the mask of invincibility began to crack. When the verdict came, It was final. Guilty on all counts. The Teflon Don had finally been pinned down. The FBI had won. After years of humiliation, they had their trophy. John Gotti was sentenced to life in prison without parole, a stunning fall for the man who once seemed untouchable. The nickname Teflon Don no longer applied. The charges had stuck, the legend had shattered, and the cameras that once adored him now captured his defeat. For the government, it was justice. For the Mafia, it was betrayal. For John Gotti, it was the end of the game he had played so recklessly in the spotlight. But even in defeat, his story wasn't finished. The final chapter of John Gotti's life would play out not in the streets of New York, but behind the bars of a federal prison. In the spring of 1992, the verdict was read inside a Manhattan courtroom. After years of dazzling acquittals, after countless headlines praising his invincibility, John Gotti, the Dapper Don, the Teflon Don, was finally convicted on all counts: murder, racketeering, loan sharking, obstruction of justice. The courtroom buzzed as the weight of the sentence fell. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The cameras that once captured Gotti smiling outside the Ravenite social club now focused on his grim march toward federal custody. For the man who had reveled in the spotlight, the fall was as public as the rise. The irony of Gotti's downfall was that the FBI alone hadn't beaten him. What destroyed him came from within. Betrayal by Salvatore's Sammy the Bull Gravano, his underboss and closest confidant. Gravano had been the muscle behind many of Gotti's decisions, orchestrating hits, running crews, and keeping the Gambino family in line. But when the Ravenite tapes revealed Gotti blaming him for murders and reckless actions, Gravano made a choice that shocked the underworld. He flipped. On the witness stand, Gravano calmly described the inner workings of the Gambino empire. He pointed at his former boss, detailing how Gotti had ordered the murders of Castellano, Bilotti, and others. For jurors, his testimony was devastating. For Gotti, it was the ultimate betrayal. In the Mafia, betrayal is the cardinal sin. Yet here was his most loyal lieutenant breaking the code of omerta. The boss who had demanded absolute loyalty was undone by the disloyalty of one man. After his conviction, Gotti was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, one of the most secure federal prisons in the country. Gone were the silk suits, the Rolex watches, the Cadillac limousines. Instead, he wore a beige prison uniform, ate cafeteria meals, and lived under 23-hour lockdown. For a man who had once controlled billions of dollars in rackets and commanded hundreds of soldiers, prison life was suffocating. Yet Gotti tried to maintain his image. He carried himself with the same swagger, refusing to show weakness even behind bars. Inmates respected him, guards feared him, and visitors still saw flashes of the charismatic boss. But the truth was inescapable. He was caged, powerless, and cut off from the empire he had built. As the years passed, Gotti's health deteriorated. In the mid-1990s, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. Treatments weakened him, and the once imposing stylish Don became frail. By the early 2000s, photographs showed a man barely recognizable. No longer the Dapper Don, but a sick prisoner waiting for the end. On June 10, 2002, John Gotti died at the age of 61 in the Federal Prison Hospital in Springfield, Missouri. His body was flown back to New York, where he was buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, the same cemetery that held other Mafia legends like Lucky Luciano and Carlo Gambino. Even in death, his presence stirred controversy. Crowds gathered, some to mourn, others to gawk. To his family, he was a husband and father. To his followers, he was a fallen king. To law enforcement, he was the man who proved that even the untouchable could be touched. John Gotti's legacy is as complicated as the man himself. To the neighborhoods of Queens and Brooklyn, he remains a folk hero, a man who gave money to locals, who fought the government, who represented pride for the working-class Italian community. To law enforcement, he is a symbol of arrogance, recklessness, and the dangers of glorifying organized crime. To the Mafia itself, he is a cautionary tale, a Don who broke the rule of silence, drew too much attention, and paid the ultimate price. The Mafia had thrived for decades on secrecy. Gotti turned it into spectacle. For a brief moment, he made the Mafia glamorous again, with front-page headlines and television cameras. But that same visibility destroyed him. He proved that no one, not even the Teflon Don, was beyond the reach of betrayal and the law. John Gotti's story offers haunting lessons about power, pride, and downfall. Fame is fragile. What made him loved by the public also made him vulnerable to the FBI. Loyalty is never guaranteed. Even the most trusted ally can turn when survival is at stake. The Mafia is unforgiving. Tradition demands silence, and those who break it risk everything. For all his style and charisma, Gotti ended the same way as countless mobsters before him: imprisoned, betrayed, and dead before old age. In the end, John Gotti's rise and fall encapsulate the paradox of the Mafia itself, built on loyalty but destroyed by betrayal, cloaked in secrecy yet undone by fame. The man who once walked through Little Italy like a king, adored by crowds and feared by enemies, died alone in a prison hospital bed. But his story endures, not just in FBI case files or Mafia lore, but in the fascination of a public that still remembers the Dapper Don, the gangster who lived like a celebrity, defied the government, and finally fell to the very forces he thought he could outsmart.